Hey guys, this is Nick Bratton with Bratton Sports Performance. Today I'm going to take you guys through our hip external rotation stretch. Now this is a stretch that we use with a number of our athletes, specifically those that are tight through the back sides of their hips, whether it be glute max, glute medius, even a little bit of that low back musculature. And so this is something that we program, for our young and old athletes, but for those guys who have trouble with that hip external rotation, whether we notice it within sprinting or even some of the lifts that we're going to go through. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of variations today, one from the ground and another one using a box based on our ability to get up and down, but also our hip mobility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get set up and then we'll get going. So first we're going to start out going through our hip external rotation stretch using a box. Now there's a number of reasons why we would use a box as opposed to getting set up on the ground. When we incorporate the box, one, it may be due to our inability to get down to the ground. So if we're working with one of our older adults, this would be one of our typical setups or exercises that we would use. But also if we have a lack of hip mobility, typically it's best to start out with the box and then to work down to that lower position, since being on the ground will force us into more external rotation and even a little bit of hip flexion as well. So when we set up, I'm going to start out with a box that's a little bit shorter than our hips, somewhere between our knees and our hips. I'll put a pad over the top just for comfort. But when we set up, I'm going to place my shin on the box, parallel with the box, perpendicular to my body. From this position, I want to start out in a tall position, trying to keep the shin flat on the box. From here, I just want to try and drop my hips down. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a squat in order to get into that stretch. Again, trying to keep my torso up tall. If I don't feel a lot of stretch through the back side of the hips, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to go into a little bit of forward flexion at the hips. From there, I should be able to feel that stretch again through the outside and back side of the hip, really targeting that glute max, glute med. And so as we go through this, depending on where we're putting this within our workout, we may use this as more of a dynamic stretch going into some rocking patterns, or if it's toward the end of our workout and we're cooling down, it may be one of our static stretches where we're holding for 10 to 15 seconds for a number of sets. Give me just a second and we'll get set up for the stretch on the floor. Alright, so next we're going to go through our hip external rotation stretch from the floor. Again, this is something that we're going to use within our athletes who have a little more hip mobility, are able to get up and down fairly easily. And so when we get set up here, typically I'm going to start out in a push-up position, so we have one neutral position we can start from in order to start using those teaching cues. So I'll get in the top of a push-up position. From here, I'm going to do the same thing that I did when I was at the box, okay? So I'm going to go through that hip flexion with a little bit of external rotation to put my shin on the ground. Now, I'll typically cue for the athlete to pull their uninvolved, or for me, my right leg back just a little bit. Now, at this point, I should begin to feel that stretch within the outside of my hip, on that bent hip, the involved hip, so right now my left. If I don't, I can always work down to my forearms to create a little more flexion within the hip. Again, this is something that we typically use toward the end of a workout, and so we're going to use it in more of a static position. We'll typically hold for 10 to 15 seconds at a time, going through 2 to 3 sets of it. So if you're someone who tends to have some tightness within the backside of your hips, you have some issue with squats, being able to get to the depth that you'd like, or being able to keep your knees out, tracked out over your feet as you're squatting down, implement this into your exercises. Put this in your warm-up, even use it as your cool down a couple of times a week. If you have any questions on the setup or going through this movement, or prescribing something in order to help you go through, again, those sprint drills and getting into your lifting positions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks.